to Lori, Carrie, and Stephanie. And in advance, thank you very much for your time and expertise here today.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm going to get us started by just briefly pulling up our Faculty Senate Inclusion and Diversity Committee committee charge. I hope everybody can see this. So for this session today, in this second part, we're moving from looking at microaggressions to institutional racism. And soon you'll understand what that means. We're going to share examples, and Lori and Stephanie both have some information they'll be sharing today. We do have a full program, so I'm going to move very quickly. But please know, if you do want to access our committee charge, this can also be found on the Faculty Senate website. So I'm going to stop sharing and just move straight to Stephanie. Sorry, I'll give you a second.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I'm sorry, everyone, my dog is in the background growing. Okay, can you see my screen? Is it working?
I can, all good.
Great. Well, hello everybody and welcome back. Today I'm going to go over the readings briefly. If you didn't read them, no big deal. It's not homework. You're not being graded, so no quiz. Or is there? The first one reading, like I said, I'm not really going to go over the whole thing. I just want to kind of, Carrie sort of mapped these out. This particular reading was trapped between justified anger and being the strong Black woman, Black college women coping with racial battle fatigue at historically and predominantly white institutions. One of the things I think that was a highlight of this that we identified was the construction of irrationality surrounding Black women's expression of anger can cause them to self-police and remain silent, which robs them of their opportunity or agency to address critical issues. So, I think this is an important slide. So if everyone just wants to take a minute and kind of look over it, we won't stay here too long. And I think the other important piece of this is a quote there on the right-hand side that talks about there's a fear of being labeled for people as an angry Black woman that makes you bite your tongue, right? It's designed to shut you up. And so I think that's a really important piece of all of this, is remembering that particular phrase. The second reading was Racial Battle Fatigue and Activist Burnout in Racial Justice Activists of Color at Predominantly White Colleges and Universities. This is really discussing what happens when you burn out, when you do this work all the time. And so I think that's another important piece of all of this, right, is the stress associated with activism wears away activists, right? The physical and emotional well-being. They're forced to disengage to protect themselves. So that's another important piece. And finally, the Rethinking Racism toward a Structural Interpretation. This is a little different, right? But this is about the concept. One of the things that I thought was that was really interesting from this paper was the idea that we often view racists in particular as just being, sort of their own singular person, right? And it's a personal issue, but this really talks more about how it's a structural issue and not just a personal issue. So I wanted to talk a little bit about definitions now. The definition of institutional racism. It's distinguished from the explicit attitudes and bias of individuals. It's the existence of systemic policies, laws, practices, regulations that provide for and allow for disparities in goods, services, opportunities, education, housing, careers, and more. I think this is an important thing to really focus on, is that it's not de facto, which is what oftentimes the excuse is made, right? So it's not a social policy, or it's not something that the government doesn't have a hand in, or other regulatory bodies or systems. It is de jure, and there are actual documents and documentation of these things. So what does institutional racism, oops, I'm sorry, there's a typo at the top, look like? It's disguised as often standard, sorry, another typo, standard operating procedures, good and great schools with oftentimes almost zero diversity. So this is one to think about, when you look at websites like greatschools.org and other systems by which they rank schools, you'll notice that the best schools often have almost zero diversity. Um, the comments about good neighborhoods, right? So what is a good neighborhood? What does that mean when you say that? And we talked a little bit about this last time, is like the practice of like, oh, you lock your doors, or you're scared in a quote bad neighborhood. Structural organization, as far as what does the overall organization of the particular entity look like, whether it's a corporation or a university or other organizations, what does that look like? Who are the people at the top? Organizational practices, hiring practices such as the usual suspects or safe minorities, meaning you select people that will be in the minority class or definition, but yet they're considered safe, or you repeatedly tap the safe minorities in your organization to participate in DEI related things or other committees, even outside of DEI, because they're safe or they are considered, not too radical. And the thing is, something to look at is who gets the endowed chair positions, who gets the teaching awards, who gets the advising awards. Look at those people and see who's receiving those awards. And then who gets awards such as diversity awards or things related to that, right? And then one of the other things we talk about is the right fit in hiring. What does the right fit mean? That's a common phrase that people like to use over and over again. Well, we want the right fit. And what does that actually mean when you read between the lines? Another big thing is focusing on individual incidents and not overhauling the structure, right? So we all can get worked up and focus on, for instance, if there's an incident of racism or if there's an incident of, something inappropriate or particular, like I said, just these particular incidents, rather than looking at what's the root cause, right? It's that very much, instead of us being Smokey the Bear, we're being the fireman. Looking at hiring practices, who are on hiring committees, how do we go about searches, all those different things. And then I also want to talk about DEI as a promotion and tenure tool, right? So it's become very fashionable to include things about inclusion and diversity on your resume, on your CV, to participate in those things. But what's the real intent behind that participation? I want to use some examples. I think examples are really helpful to people. So one of the things people always talk about is, why or how do we know that systemic or institutional racism exists? And I will say this, so my background is in real property. Segregation was actually written into the Federal Housing Authority manual. And so while it wasn't a law, quote unquote, it was a regulation. And these regulations existed well into the 70s, and they still haven't really been fixed. So that's something to think about, that these are actual regulations written into the federal government. And a little case study, if you ever want to watch, there is a documentary about this. But for instance, in Levittown, New York, in the 1940s, or shortly after World War II, there was the very first ever housing development was created. They often call it the first suburb. And those houses cost $6,990, and they were especially open to World War II veterans who had the GI Bill. But written into the actual deeds and the regulations around that development was white-only families. So if you were white, you could purchase a house in Levittown. There were 17,447 houses built there. Um, and to this day, that land is still 73% white owned. And if you purchase that home, or your grandparents or your parents purchased those homes in 1940s, The average home value in Levittown now is $508,000 a year. So that's a 7,172 and some change increase in value. So if you think about the wealth and the liquid wealth that you were able to build, if you would have had access to that home, if you had been a person of color, it's quite shocking. And then the other thing I want to say is to think that racism is simply a personal problem or is a psychological issue is incorrect. We often say that, right? Is that, oh, a racist person is just a stupid person, or it's just only overt racism that we're worried about. But that is incorrect and adds to the contemporary status of systemic and institutionalized racism. So I want to just repeat again that de facto segregation and de facto racism are myths that are used to perpetuate the idea. And these are some comments from the actual government descriptions of neighborhoods in Kalamazoo, Detroit. And this is how they prevented loans and insurance in what were considered bad or neighborhoods with people who were undesirable. And so that prevented people from getting loans, prevented them from getting insurance, mortgages, all the things, and that and still to this day hurts the home values in those regions, because how we appraise homes today, if any of you have ever bought a house, is looking at historical home sales. Just take a look at that for a second. Last week we covered microaggressions. I'm not going to repeat all these, but just for anybody who wasn't here, microaggressions are the real or perceived verbal and nonverbal environmental slights, snubs, and insults that communicate negative or hostile messages to marginalized or perceived marginalized people. And the second quote is also whether it's intentional or unintentional, it communicates those same things to the targeted people. Finally, the term discrimination, we hear that often, but what does it really mean? And there's several different definitions. The Federal Housing Authority has one. The federal government has some. Different states and cities have different. But in general, what we're talking about is employment, housing, social domains, and other scenarios that prevents people from certain protected classes or from certain minority groups from having equal treatment in those realms. It also can come in the form of victimization and retaliation. So, and to put it simply, this is when you're treated differently because of your race. Treatment can be a one-off action or as a result of a rule or policy based on race. It does not have to be intentional to be unlawful. So it can be unintentional and still be illegal. All right, now I'm turning it back over to Lori. How do I stop sharing?
Thank you, Stephanie. That was great. Exactly what we needed. Good morning to everyone. I had a stop and smell the roses moment this morning. My mother would be proud. I was walking down the hallways of the hospital, and for some reason it occurred to me to think, I am so happy to have my job. And the idea of gratefulness popped into my head, and I thought, I am grateful to have the opportunities that this job has afforded me. And so with those thoughts in mind, I want to wish everybody a happy Monday as we move through this presentation. We're going to play some clips now, and you are going to hear me say a couple of things over and over this morning. So I'm going to start with them now. The first is that the clips and the stories that we have used over the past year represent our evidence of the problems. So I want you to stop right now and go into the chat and tell us what you think the problems are that we are trying to address as an institution. Name the problems. And then I want you to think about whether you've seen those problems somewhere else, listed, described. But go into the chat and name the problems you think we're trying to solve as an institution. And while you do that, I'd like to tell you about an old policy-making rule. Actually, it's a 20th century policy-making rule. But it says that whoever gets to name the problem determines the solutions. How you name that problem determines and puts barriers or gates around what the solutions are that are on the table that you're able to consider. Next, as you put those ideas in the chat, we're going to queue up our clips. We have 3 clips this morning that we're going to share with you, and we call these clips Binders of Black and Brown Bodies, Living Microaggressions, and Am I Under Arrest Here, Officer? Carrie, can you start with the clips, please?
I will. Let me make sure I have all those settings checked. I do. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
We can.
Okay. I'm going to apologize. My dog is barking. So hopefully that doesn't interrupt our listening. All right.
I'm buying
So-
something so that it can make noises in the background.
I know, right? So I'm going to play these 3 clips in a row. And sometimes I find it helpful just to be able to take it in if maybe it helps to, I don't know, maybe look down or close your eyes. If something comes to mind, maybe jot an idea down. Or if you're able to write in the chat, as Lori indicated, you can do that at the same time. All right, here we go. I think the last time I talked to you, we were just in the throes of trying to get the faculty on board with even wanting to hire Black and brown people. We had just gotten over the faculty meeting in which someone said we shouldn't sacrifice another position to do a diversity hire. So we ended up drafting an ad. We did a lot of research on what the ad should say. We got a lot of help from experts. We got input from other faculty, and we thought the ad was great. Other people read the ad and thought it was great. We presented the ad at the next faculty meeting, and only a couple of people spoke, even though we devoted a rather large portion of the meeting to discussion about the ad. The ad passed faculty vote with overwhelming support. After the faculty meeting, one faculty member wrote a disparaging post on Facebook about me and the people who helped draft the ad, calling us hypocritical and duplicitous. Coincidentally, the same person who said this on Facebook is the same person who used the word sacrifice when discussing the possibility of hiring Black and brown faculty. I'm like, okay, this is not personally benefiting me or anybody who helped me work on this. This is for the benefit of the department, and we're taking so much crap from you guys just trying to get you on board with hiring more Black and brown faculty. And so that happened. I don't know what the fallout from that was because we were just instructed to not talk to the faculty who were involved in the Facebook post, but apparently nothing happened to them. And so the ad is just sitting there. It's literally just sitting there, and now our chair is pretending like everything in the department has to be 100% perfect and that everybody has to get along before we can even move forward with posting the ad. And that's not going to happen right now. Then I have this colleague, a white lady, who is insisting that we have almost like a Mitt Romney thing. He said he had binders full of women during a 2012 presidential debate, but instead, she is insisting we have something like binders full of Black and brown prospective faculty that we need to personally reach out to and contact, and that we need to pay for a list of people. You know, we need to pay for these binders of Black and brown faculty in order to do this search. She even began creating her own Excel spreadsheets where she could look up PhD students on the job market and assign race to them based on their appearance. And I'm like, that's not the issue. We know where to find diverse faculty. That's not a problem. We don't need to purchase these binders, and we don't need her to create them. What we need to do is to create a departmental climate that is supportive of Black and brown faculty. What she is doing is really disturbing. Our chair cannot see why we were disturbed by this.
I have been in work situations as an adult, actually, pretty much everywhere, including at the university, where you bring food that smells different and then someone comments on it. That food smells gross. What's that smell? And that's one of the microaggressions I didn't get to cover last week, but I really wish I had when I look back on it, reflecting on it. It's very painful when people make fun of what you're eating, right? It instantly makes you not want to eat. Now as an adult, I take a little harder stance and I'm just like, this is what I'm eating, like suck it up. But it still hits back to that experience as a child being made fun of every time, that trauma. And part of me is like, oh, don't snowflake out, just like just like get over it. But it's hard. And I've been in work situations with other people who are not um necessarily eating like culturally American food where they've been picked on, and that's a big one. Or even to this day, I get, oh, what are you eating, a cat or a dog?
I joined with several faculty members to report a high-level person in our school for discrimination. We were an African American and 2 members of the LGBTQ community. They filed their claim in DEI as discrimination. I was embarrassed. I thought folks might think I was playing the race card, but I was scared and having panic attacks and angry. So I filed harassment and bullying charges in HR. When you open the investigation, if your institutional reps believe you, and I say believe because you are made to tell your story over and over, verbally and in writing, several times. So eventually you feel like you must plead your case to be believed. If believed, the institutional reps tell you that the case will be referred out for investigation to an outside law firm. The institutional reps say it's important that there be a neutral party investigating the claim. But after a while, you realize the law firm is not neutral. They get related business and contracts from the school. Then the firm enhances its reputation, and in turn, the firm makes all kinds of contributions to the school in time and money. You soon realize that you see the neutral party, the law firm's name, on programs, buildings, committees. This is the neutral entity that is going to investigate your case. The law firm interviews you many times and they call witnesses. You don't even know about the witnesses, but they may think that they are crucial. So they may call your dean in and talk with that person. They may call your chair or your colleagues. You never see any documents during the investigation. You don't even see documents at the conclusion of the investigation. And eventually, again, your competency, believability, and motivations are on trial. They are questioned. While this investigation proceeded, the person was left in place with their full rights and privileges. So, despite my pleas to disallow that person from taking action against me, that person was allowed to continue to act. This included additional emotional bullying, harm to my reputation by influencing another set of external people they knew as friends to pull my grant. And they had other people that reported to them to pull me from my classes that semester. The result, my annual evaluation reflected lower ratings with no recognition of that person's role or that that person was under investigation for discrimination. Yes, eventually that person was demoted, but they kept their job, their salary, and other duties at the school for another 3 years. I later heard they helped to write the school's 5-year strategic plan. This person left when they found another high-level position. Eventually, all of us were asked if we were satisfied with the conclusion of the investigation when it was done. I believe that my colleagues were asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I was simply called into HR and asked if I was satisfied. I asked for some time to think about the conclusion, came back, and made a request not to serve under my chair because I thought there would be conflict. I was not granted that request. I was simply told to go back to my position and resume my duties, with the harm to my reputation intact, my lower ratings on my annual evaluation, and a continued fear of my competency, my ability to make my way in the world unharmed. Rose-colored glasses shattered.
Thank you for playing those clips, Carrie. Please go into the chat box and identify any feelings that you have as a result of those clips. We're curious to know if they stretch your credulity. Are they believable? Do you understand the meaning behind the clips? There are emotional ramifications. There are also institutional ramifications, and making connections between the stories, the institution, and solutions is key. And that's what we're going to talk about now as we move to this next part of our presentation. I'm going to do the share screen dance. I'm going to ask for a thumbs up as soon as I get the presentation up. Can people see the slide? Great.
We can, Lori.
All right. Time check. It is 11:28. I believe that this is going to take 10 or 12 minutes. We will have time for discussion, and I think we'll have time to open up the microphone to talk. At the close of our first year, when the committee existed, the Senate Faculty Inclusion and Diversity Committee, it occurred to me that we needed a framework. It occurred to me because, first of all, I love frameworks. So I use everything I do as a framework or a diagram. And I thought, we don't have one that drives our work. We don't have anything that explains what we're doing. But it was the end of our first year and we were closing out a lot of things, and I never got around to developing that. This year, it became clear what that framework should be, what that might look like. And so we started working on that. I unveiled a draft to Carrie and Stephanie in the last 3 days. We've been refining it, and so we're going to unveil it. We are curious to see what you think about it. It is a draft. But first, what I want to do is talk about our work and our recommendations, and the sense of cognitive dissonance that we sometimes have as a committee in working in this space. We are aware that there could be questions about our recommendations in relation to the university's stated progress. And so we want to respond to that. We're going to respond to that in our end of year report, but we didn't want to seem like we were oblivious and operating in a vacuum. And so to those that would wonder about our recommendations, our evidence, and the message that we're sending, we would simply say that there are 3 ideas that we want people to keep in mind. The first is transparency versus camouflage. The second idea is top-down versus integrative, and the third idea is dialogue versus monologue. So you heard me talk about naming the problem for accuracy. What is the problem that we're dealing with? And I think a lot of you all did an excellent job with identifying the problem in the chat box. Thank you for that. But when we talk about the problem that we are trying to address, the first question is, where's the data? Where's the evidence? And who owns that data and that evidence? At the end of our first year, we presented quantitative IPEDS data showing the lack of promotion and tenure and hiring for BIPOC faculty at the university. That data was presented and there was no response to it. And so we've gone about this year collecting evidence, data. We wanted to make it different. We wanted to make it impactful. And so we collected these stories. And the problem, what is the problem? There seems to be an absence of a clear vision on the part of the institution for the problem we're solving. Sometimes it's safety provided by the police. But for many of us and out in the real world, it's, are we safe from the police? How you state that problem determines the breadth and depth of the solutions that we're looking at. In one instance, we have been told the problem is that women need to speak up. They need to get their act together. They need to lean in. We're just not putting in enough. Or as my mother would say, put your nose to the grindstone. But is that the problem, or is it that there's favoritism, bullying, discrimination, and harassment that needs to be addressed? It's possible that it's both of those, but they operate at opposite ends of a continuum. And if you only state one as the problem, then you only get certain kinds of solutions that are implemented. The other issue that drives our work is the need for external witnesses. What is done is internal to the institution. It is internal departments, internal people talking to each other as if the wheel does not exist. We are inventing the wheel. That's just not true. We know that there's so much action around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that there are experts, that there are models that we could adopt, policies, rules, and regulations and practices that we should look at, but our conversation is internal. The notion of true engagement is central. We've been thinking about this in government, not a great example, right, for some of you, but we've been talking about this in government for 30 or 40 years. How do we engage with the community so that we produce real solutions that work for people who are living these experiences? And so what we've observed is that there is this top-down messaging, and there are ways for us to send a message, but there's no real-time engagement. There is no guarantee that you will get a response back. If you get a response back, it's one-to-one. There is no mechanism in the institution for real-time dialogue happening, and then the production of communication, information, and reports. Power imbalances. Those that operate in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the university are not always autonomous in their freedom. If you are fearful for your job or promotion, or you get favoritism from a certain group, then placing you on a committee to do this work is unfair and unjust. Are you able to truly speak about what you are observing? And so those are the reasons why we make the recommendations. And we just wanted to be clear about what's driving some of our work. Here is the model. This is a pathway diagram. And as I said, I use them quite a bit to explore the origins, causes, and solutions to problems. I think of it as ground truthing. And those who are in geography will excuse me. I may be borrowing a term from geography that sounds good to me, and they may have deeper meaning for that, but it's like reality testing, deductive and inductive reasoning. We can test out specific instances in the model to see if the model can accommodate that instance, or put in general and specific truths together to see if we can reach a conclusion with this model. In this case, we're going to consider the data or evidence presented by the stories that we've shared with you. And then we're also going to look at our recommendations within the body of the model and determine if the model works and represents the ideals, stories, and recommendations that we are making. On the right, if you start at that side of the model, what you see is the problem that we're trying to solve. In this case, it's harm, named as discrimination, that shows up as loss of opportunities and resources based on stigmatized social status, which in the case of the US means race and ethnicity. What you should note at this point is that stigma, hatred, inhumane treatment of some, endures across time. The model has an element of temporality. It has a time element. Root causes of the problem are on the far left. Again, in the case of the United States, we're looking at societal values, ideas, cognitive models that act as silent guides to understanding. As Isabel Wilkerson says in her latest book, Caste, these kinds of societal values show up silently and act as a guide to how you're going to interpret phenomena. What happens when you encounter those who are different from you? It's a silent script. The other factor, cause of the loss of opportunities and resources at the right-hand side of the model, is history, historical factors, mainly slavery in the United States, could be defined as the use of other humans as goods, less than human to achieve capitalistic gains, is what some scholars have said. But history is important. And what we see is that history and these quiet scripts that we have get left out of consideration. And this is what happens when people say institutional racism died when we ended slavery. Or this is what people mean when they say, it's so long ago, how can we account for that? So we are dropping out those silent scripts that run in our head. We're not accounting for historical factors that still exist and drive what we see on the right-hand side of the model. And this becomes important when we're thinking again about origins of the problem and solutions. And so if we accept the temporal element of this model where stigma and hatred continue across time, then what we recognize is that these things change. They change in shape and form. And so if you're looking at the top and the bottom of the model, the two orange boxes, which yesterday were green, I almost said green, but those two boxes in orange, institutional racism and microaggressions, are what we're dealing with in the present. And again, just remember, we dropped out that big green arrow down on the left, right? We often forget that, especially the historical factors. But what we're dealing with in the present is institutional racism and microaggressions, and they operate together. As Stephanie explained, institutional racism includes policies, regulations, rules, and practices. And they also can operate silently, which is the problem with institutional racism. It occurs, it perpetuates, it lives without question. It is just the way things are done. And no amount of data, questioning of it occurs, and the institutional racism continues to live. I want you to take note of 3 or 4 other elements in this model. In the middle, you see a box that's labeled as trauma, social, emotional, and physical. And this is representative of a lot of the work that we do in the area of psychology. We're now doing this work in health research, and we're recognizing that there is a physical manifestation of racism that occurs in the body, upon the body of populations. Those who operate in the realm of psychology have known for quite some time that it is possible for racism to impact the population's sense of being, competency, self-efficacy, a sense of resiliency. A lot of those ideas are now being incorporated into health, and we are considering how to actually measure how racism works within the body and upon the body of populations. How does it get under the skin to shape the physical manifestations that we see that show up as health and social disparities? These are important questions, but as I will point out later on, they are questions that call to mind different kinds of solutions. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, if we are operating in that area where it says trauma, if that is where you're operating, do we have an obligation to still address what's at the right-hand side of the model? what we have stated to be the problem. It reminds me of those discussions that I've seen about resiliency, mindfulness, bringing yoga to Harlem. There's nothing wrong with those solutions. But again, if you identify that as the problem, what are we missing out on? What is it that we're not addressing? The other part of this model that I want to point out is the box that says denial of racism. And that box is there for those who would say, I don't recognize racism. I don't feel racism. If you don't feel racism or you deny that it exists, and this is particularly true for BIPOC populations, does that mean that the racism does not exist? And in this model, theoretically, we are saying it still exists. Where you would not recognize it, you may still experience loss of opportunities and resources. What you don't experience, perhaps, is the trauma, the emotional trauma, the trauma on your body, within your body. But denial of racism does not mean that it does not exist. The other interesting idea that we are positing in this model, you see in the box on the right-hand side. It says high functioning systems, resilient, adaptive, and hierarchical. A high functioning system is positive, right? If we have this system that's able to live and work, then we would think that that is a positive. In the case of this framework, this pathway diagram, consider, this is a pathway diagram for discrimination and institutional racism. And so in combination, those three characteristics have deep implications. Resilience is a measure of a system's ability to survive and persist, even in the face of great pressure to change. Using, for example, the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement. This model continues to work. This system continues to work. It's resilient. The framework is adaptive. It can make and remake its structure simpler or more complex, even in the face, again, of external pressure. And last, because it is a high functioning system, it has hierarchical arrangements. It has subsystems, almost like an octopus. I think an octopus has 8 arms. If you cut off one arm, it continues to function or it grows another. And so like that, this system is hierarchical. And so taken together, when you think about this model, this framework, and that it's a high functioning system and the continued implications of it over time through history, then we begin to see interesting, complicated manifestations of the framework. The last idea that I want to address with this model is the box that you see down on the lower right-hand corner, continued benefits of an unintentional system. It is not lost on me that the person or the group that designs this model looks at it through the lens of their experiences. And so I would simply say that where we have looked at this system and designed this model to reflect our lived experiences, there are those who would look at the model and say, well, it's unintentional. It continues to benefit that population. And so it is in their interest to say it's an unintentional system. It is in their interest to say, we don't recognize this. How can this be reality? But again, the idea of ground truthing, testing out instances, and determining if they hold true within the system becomes important. And this is the exercise that we're engaged in. We are now at the end of our second year of existence as a committee, and we are getting ready to put forth our recommendations. So you all get an early look, not only at the framework, but at our recommendations. And I want to remind you of the chat. Please put any comments in the chat about that model. We are really interested in your thoughts. And now we're going to talk about our draft set of recommendations. We have 14 recommendations that we're making. We have created a feasibility analysis that we're using to monitor, measure, think about those recommendations. We thought that this was important because we wanted to make sure, again, that the recommendations were realistic, or at least fit the context in which we are operating. You will see in this slide that there was an attempt to weight these factors in the feasibility analysis. Again, that's not permanent. So these are kind of weighted, but not really. So the factors in our feasibility analysis are agreeability, regulatory, status, next step, social capital, fiscal, and power. I'm going to briefly describe what each one of those measures mean within the feasibility analysis. So when we talk about agreeability, that is simply a measure of is it likable? Do people like it? Are people kind of offended by it? How's that going to go over? So there's a measure of agreeability. Regulatory refers to barriers that are legal. Do we have to go to the Board of Governors for approval of that recommendation? Are there other kinds of federal and state legal barriers to that recommendation? Status refers to who's been working on this issue. Describe that work so that we can indicate that in our assessment of the feasibility of that recommendation. Next steps. We are making next steps. Can we identify something that we would do next around that recommendation to push it forward? There is no point in a recommendation that is inoperable. And so we thought that next steps would be important. We are taking account of social capital. Are there groups that we can work with to further that recommendation? Or are we just doing this alone? Who can we collaborate with around that particular recommendation? There are fiscal issues. When we make this recommendation, does it have a fiscal note? And then there is power. Who is against that recommendation? Is the institution against the recommendation? And that's been weighted at 8. It's a huge factor. It doesn't matter pretty much what the recommendation is. If the institution is against the recommendation, we are keenly aware that that is probably a non-starter, at least in this year with the windows that are open or closed. It doesn't mean that the recommendation could not eventually work. These are our recommendations. There are 14 of them. You see 3 recommendations in red. And what I'll demonstrate next is where in the pathway model those recommendations lie, because we think that they relate to certain areas in that pathway model. The rest of the recommendations, we think, fall squarely into the area of the model labeled as institutional racism, loss of opportunities and resources. And in that sense, these are recommendations that are attached to policies, practices, rules that need to be implemented. And so quickly, one of our first recommendations that lives on, and actually the first 3 recommendations live on from the first year, the social equity teams, a climate assessment that measures inclusion and diversity at the university, a recommendation to address contra-power. And this is the idea that someone or some group who typically would have less authority than the other group is pushing back. And when we think about that, we're thinking about students in a classroom, who have decided to agree that they're going to disagree with the instructor or rate that instructor low as a group. Those are instances of contra-power. There are instances of contra-power when students approach faculty in a manner that is disrespectful or hostile. Those are examples of contra-power. The other recommendations, an annual report detailing UPD interactions with the community, a mechanism to report police misconduct, development of a DEI assessment tool of best practices, redesigning faculty evaluations, including the promotion and tenure process, stopping unpaid labor when we engage in efforts to educate and bring awareness to diversity and inclusion, which seems to be an important goal. Are we given credit for that? Does it show up in our promotion and tenure packet? Is there value? Is that work valued? We think it's important to develop a comprehensive BIPOC faculty recruitment plan. There's so many efforts going on around the university. There is no comprehensive guidance on it. No way to tell that unit how to conduct that recruitment. One of our novel ideas that came to us from a member of our committee is tracking and dismissing those who are not proactively pursuing and exhibiting DEI in some way. That sounds big and scary. It's probably meant to sound that way. This recommendation came to us from someone who had seen that enacted at another university. And so we're really thinking about, can we incorporate DEI efforts in an annual report? Highlight it. Did you read a book? Did you do something different in your class? Did you serve on a committee and talk about inclusion and diversity? Are you working against inclusion and diversity so that when you are assessed, it's measured in some way? This is an interesting recommendation. We recognize that, and there are a lot of parts of it that have to be defined, but it's a start, and we want to put it on the table. So again, I'm going to look at the recommendations and talk about where they fit on the model. So let me do this quickly because I think I've gone over time. So investigation and binders of bodies. We think that those stories are evidence of institutional racism. The story on food is a microaggression. We think that a lot of what we do at the university is meant to focus on microaggressions, stigma, trying to get people to think differently about others that are different. So there are trainings, books, readings, high-profile speakers. A lot of that work I call trying to change hearts and minds. And so we spend a lot of time on that work at the university. The other area, though, that we're interested in is policies and recommendations around institutional racism and the loss of opportunities and resources. And so we want to function in that space with our recommendations. And last, I would simply say that those who are working in health or psychology and you're focused on trauma and what racism does to the body, please keep doing that work. It is excellent work, but alone it is not the answer to institutional racism and discrimination.